Take a moment to explore the Node.js and Angular application and look at things like the project structure, how Node.js and Angular modules work and how they're configured, and even explore some other aspects of Angular such as modules, components, and services. So if you're already very comfortable with how Node.js modules work and how Angular modules work, you can certainly go through this module, maybe skim it, and jump right to the next one. But if you are new at all to some of the concepts we're going to cover, I would definitely recommend that you take a moment to go through it, because I'm just going to provide a quick overview of how everything's put together. And that way, in the next module, when we start building out the code, you'll understand the base behind the application that's making it possible to run. So in this module, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the project structure first off. And I'm just going to walk through some of the key files, some of the folders, so you know the lay of the land, if you will. From there, we're going to talk about the Node.js and Angular modules that are needed, and just a quick overview of how they're used in the app. I have kind of a unique way of configuring my Express Node.js routes, so we're going to talk about a convention-based routing technique that can be used. We'll also go into the fundamentals of ES6 module loaders. In this particular application, I'll be using System.js. There are many options out there, though. So I'm going to go through how System.js is configured, make sure that you understand how it's all working under the covers. And then finally, we're going to create the basic building blocks that are going to be used later in the course as we start building out our GET and PUT and POST requests and things to the RESTful service. So I'm going to show an Angular module, a component, and a service, and I'll show you the fundamentals of how all that works together if you're new to that at all. So let's go ahead and get started by jumping into the project structure and walking through what it has as far as folders and files. Let's take a quick look at some of the different files and folders that make up the overall project structure of the app that we'll be discussing throughout the course. So I've opened the application up in my VS Code editor, and as mentioned earlier, you can use any editor you'd like, but this is what I'll be using throughout the course. And I'm going to take a bottom-up approach to show you just a quick look at some of the different files and folders. So first thing, we have our tsconfig file, and this will be used to convert our Angular 2 TypeScript code down to our ES5. I'm going to be using a CommonJS module resolution system in this example. I am going to generate source maps or debug capabilities. And then I have some TypeScript and Angular 2 specific features in this area. So I'm going to support decorators such as the component decorator. I'm also going to make sure that some of the folders are excluded so that the TypeScript compiler doesn't waste time jumping into the Node modules or this public lib folder. And we also have the Node.js file itself that acts as the server. So this will be our Express server. You'll notice I'm importing some Express specific features, some modules here. And then I have some custom modules down here. Now, I'm also using some ES 2015 features, such as a class here to organize my code kind of nicely. Certainly optional. I decided to throw this in to show that you could now with Node. And this is the actual file that, as mentioned, kicks off the server that we'll be using. Now, the README is going to have the instructions for running the app locally or through Docker. So if you didn't go through the section earlier in the course where I showed how to get the app up and running, you'll find all the details in here. And then we have our standard package JSON. This will have our Angular modules as well as our Node.js modules. Now, the gulp file I ran earlier, and this was used to copy our Angular 2 libraries and supporting scripts into a static files folder Express uses called public. So really, one of the main things that the gulp file is used for is just to get the scripts from Angular into this folder called public, into this lib folder. So you'll notice our different Angular scripts in here. Now, if you're new to this, the public folder is used by Express by default, although you could change the name if you wanted, but it's used to serve up your CSS, your images, your JavaScript files, and things like that. And so I'm just using gulp to copy those necessary Angular 2 scripts into here, and that's where they'll be served up by Express. Now, it can also be used to do SAS and things like that. Some minification is in here for compressing scripts, watching for changes, and things along those lines. But really, I'm just using it to get our Angular 2 scripts into the lib folder. So we ran that a little bit earlier. Now, moving on up, we have our Docker Compose file. If you wanted to use the Docker option that I provided and showed how to run earlier, then that's available for you. And then we have the standard git ignore for ignoring files from source control. Now, a little bit later, I'm going to talk more about how routing works. I like to use a convention-based routing approach. It's not the standard approach that Express uses. It allows us to have a convention-based folder approach that I put into this controllers folder. So this will actually have all the functions that convert MongoDB data into JSON data that can go down to Angular as it makes HTTP calls. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I like the approach. It really cleans up the amount of code you write, minimizes that, and provides some nice conventions you can follow. Now, moving on up, the models folder. These are going to be the schemas and model objects that really just define the objects that will be stored in our MongoDB database. So this is a customer schema, for instance, and then we have a model down here called customer that we create. And then we also have a state schema and a state model. And again, these will just represent the actual data and the structure of that data as it goes in and out of our MongoDB database. Now, the Node.js modules that actually are responsible for interacting with MongoDB are shown here. So we have our database object, which is responsible for opening and closing connections. We have a config loader, which allows us to easily get some configuration information, such as connection strings, based on the environment we're in, such as development or production. And then we have a DB seeder, which is used to get some initial data into our database. So this is just kind of fake data, so you don't have to type it in yourself. This makes it easy to get the app up and running with some data in the database. And then finally, we have our customers repository. This is where we're going to be doing queries using something called Mongoose, which is a module that can communicate with MongoDB to get our data, and then we're going to be converting that data to JSON. That'll go down to Angular. We also have a states repository, which just gets our states information. This would be like US states, for instance. So that's going to play a pretty critical role, this lib folder, in working with data in the app. Now, controllers, as mentioned, will tie into routes. We'll get back to that a little bit later. And then we have our config, which is just basic configuration info. In this case, just a connection string for MongoDB. Finally, we have our VS Code settings. These are just custom settings I have for the editor. And then we have our Docker file for Node. And this is what's actually used to create the Node image if you ran the Docker option that I showed a little bit earlier. So that's a quick run through of some of the different files and folders, and we'll be diving into several of these in more detail as we move on throughout the course. Before we jump into the actual code of the app and learn about more on routing and Angular modules and things like that, let's take a quick look at the actual NPM modules that are being used, the Node modules and the Angular modules throughout the application. So I've opened up the package.json file, and you'll see right off the bat we have the standard properties that you would normally find in this type of file. So we have the name and repository and license and things like that, but I also have a few custom NPM scripts that can run. So if you run npm run tsc, that'll just run a one-time TypeScript to ES5 compilation. That, of course, will use the tsconfig file to determine how to compile the TypeScript. If you run npm run tsc:\w, that'll do the same thing, but it sets up a watcher that'll watch for changes to our TypeScript file. And anytime you save a file, it just automatically then would compile that down to ES5. Then you have two ways you can start the server. You can run npm run server, that'll run a standard node type command, or you can run npm start, and that would run not only the nodemon to watch for changes to our node files and then restart the server if needed, but also behind the scenes run the TypeScript compiler in watch mode. And so there's an example of the one I showed earlier to get the app up and running locally. Now, as far as dependencies and dev dependencies, we have quite a few dependencies that we need on the Angular side and on the Node.js side. Now, I've stripped out the versions because they change very frequently and wanted to focus just on the modules here. But you'll notice right off the bat here, we have pretty much from here on up our Angular dependencies. So we have the standard Angular modules that you'd need, like core is one of the critical ones. We're going to be working with forms. We're going to be working with HTTP. We have some of our bootstrapping options that we'll get into, routing and things like that. And then we have our supporting scripts, Zone.js for change detection, RxJS for observables, and more. Now, everything else moving down is being used on the Express and Node.js side. Now, some of these, quite honestly, I could remove. I'm not really using a view engine per se. We have in the public folder an index.html that's actually going to represent the entire application. But I went ahead and left this in these modules here, because if you ever wanted to dynamically serve up an Angular template, or maybe the home page is dynamically served using Express, then we could do that in this case using the handlebars data binding type of engine. It's my preference with Express, but there's many options out there. You could use Pug or many others, EJS, so on and so forth. You'll see we have Mongoose, and this will be our MongoDB connectivity type of module. Morgan's a standard Express logging type of mechanism, and then I have a way to serve up that nice little fave icon that you get when you bookmark a website. Now, we also have some supporting scripts. We have concurrently is used to run multiple tasks. That'll run our TSC or TypeScript watch and our NodeMon simultaneously, kind of in parallel, if you will. I'm not using Light Server, but this is kind of a standard one for serving up static files. We have TypeScript, of course, and then the rest of these are just used with gulp. I can compress and kind of uglify my scripts and things like that. Now, the final two here are used with Angular as type definition files. This is kind of a newer technique to automatically install the type definition files for, in this case, Core.js and for Node. And these are actually used a little bit in the Angular application. So if you haven't seen this at types before, instead of running off to a site like definitelytype.org or using tools like typings, we can now get to the types for our different scripts and things directly, which is really nice as you're working with TypeScript. So that's a quick look at some of the core modules we'll be talking about. And then now as we move forward, we'll start to use these modules as we move into the Node.js side and into the Angular side of our application. As you work with Node.js and Express on the server side, you'll need to configure routes. Now, routes can be used to serve up views, your HTML that goes to the browser, or to define routes to RESTful service APIs. And that's what we're going to focus on here, because ultimately, we're all about Angular 2, talking to an Express RESTful type of service. Now, I'm going to be using a convention-based approach. The approach I'm going to show you is a little bit different than the normal for Express, but I really like it. It's certainly optional. You could do the default Express way if you'd like, but I'm going to go ahead and show you the technique I always do as I work with Node.js and Express on the server side. So jumping back into the code, you can see that I have my server.js file up here. And the server.js file, of course, is going to be what starts up the actual Node.js Express server and actually is the host of the RESTful service and also serves up our static files, our JavaScript, CSS, images, things like that. So one of the first things I need to do in addition to registering all my middleware is define my routes. Now normally in Express, you actually hard code the name of the route and the function that it calls ultimately when that route is hit as the Node.js server loads up. I don't actually like to take that approach. I have a, as mentioned, convention-based approach that I like to go with. So I have a router.js file, and we're going to come into that in a moment, and it has a load function, which we're going to call to load the routes. Now, instead of hard-coding the routes, though, I like to use a folder-based structure to define the routes. That way I don't ever actually have to define a single line of code with the name of the route in it. I can just use a folder-based structure. If I add a new route, I just add a new folder, and the app automatically picks up that change and would restart the node process. Now, the way this is going to work is we're going to come into controllers. Now, this is a folder that I like to call it. You can certainly name this whatever you want, but I'm following a similar model view controller type of pattern here. And this is my RESTful service routing. Now, API/customers, API/states, API/tokens are going to be my routes. But these routes are all going to be driven automatically as the server first starts up by using this convention-based approach. I'm not going to hard code that API customers, API states anywhere in the code base actually. Instead, what I'm going to do is use this router.js to handle everything. And it's going to parse the folder structure and then automatically generate the route. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's come on in and we're going to create a reference to this particular router.js file. So I'm going to go ahead and require the file, and we'll go from the current location down to the routes folder, and we'll grab router. And that'll pull in that module and make it available. Now the next thing I need to do is when the server initializes, you'll notice it's going to call into our middleware, seed the database, and then it's going to initialize our routes. So I'm going to come on down to init routes, and I'm going to add just a single line of code here to make the router load the routes. So I'm going to say router.load, and then the load is going to take the Express app, which is defined up at the top of the file here, and it's going to take the folder that it needs to parse to actually generate the routes. So I'm going to come in and say controllers here. Now that, of course, is the same exact folder that I just showed you right up here. So what's going to happen is the load is then going to go through these different folders recursively and keep looping until it gets to the bottom of the folder and finds a JavaScript file. Now the file I'm going to call a controller. It's really just a set of functions that are associated with the different routes. All right, so let's go ahead and save this file. And now let's jump over to our router.js, and I'll talk a little bit about what it does. Now here's the load. It takes the Express app, and it takes the folder name that we want to start with. And what it's going to do is this is only going to be called right when the server starts up. So I want to wait before everything else loads and do this synchronously. One of the rare scenarios where you'll use a synchronous function in Node, but I want to block the server from actually starting up until the routes are all parsed. So this is going to loop through everything it finds inside of the controllers and then check if it's a directory. Now if it is, such as API, it's going to recursively walk through any children. So in this case, it would then find API and then recursively walk through customers. Now, at the bottom of customers, you'll notice we have customers controller.js. That's going to hit this else if, and what we're going to do is as we keep looping through the folders, we start to build up the directories. We're going to put these into an array that you'll see here. Now I'm going to do a little string manipulation here on my directories. But the important part is down here. Every time I get to the end of a folder structure, where I know there's no more folders in here, I found the file, so I want to go ahead and now use that as the controller, the function, for an associated route. Then I'm going to fire up a new router just for that route. I'm going to create the route here. That's the base route, and then I log it. You'll see that in a moment. And then I need to load the actual controller itself, the functions for the route dynamically. So the routes will be built up dynamically based on the folder structure. Then what we're going to do is load up the controller class. So I'm going to go ahead and create a constant here. I'm just going to call it controller class. And we're going to require, and we're going to go to a full name variable. Now, full name, you're going to see here, is actually logged out. But this full name is kind of built up as we work with things. So as we are looping through, full name is going to get modified and worked with. And this will be the full name, the path, and the controller. So I'll go ahead and put full name. Now what this will do is an on-the-fly require of the customer's controller.js, for instance. Or if we go into states, once it gets to this level, it'll require states.controller.js. All right, now from here, we're going to create another constant, which is the actual controller, because I need to feed this router into the actual controller. So I'm going to say new, whatever the controller class is that we required, and I'm going to feed it the router here. Now if we go into one of these, let's go into customers, for instance, you'll notice the router's passed in, and then slash would represent the root, so it'd be API/customers in this example. This one would be API/customer/page, API/customers, and then a route parameter of ID as an example. So we'll feed that router in, This now maps any child routes unless it's a root. And then we're kind of ready to go. So now, once we have that ready, we'll just put a comment here. I'm going to associate the route with the router. And we're going to do that by using Express. So we'll say app.use. I'm going to give it the base route. That's the one where we take all the directories like API and customer, shove them together with a slash. That's our base route. And then I'm going to feed it the router, which has also been passed into our controller. So, in essence, what's going to happen behind the scenes now is when we call load, it simply parses this folder structure, automatically generates the route, and then hooks the route into this particular file, this customer's controller. Now, the customer's controller is responsible for then mapping the, in this case, root route, which would be API/customers, to this get customers. Or this particular route would be mapped into here. And we'll talk more about some of these routes and build them out individually as we move through the course. Let's come back into the router. So we'll loop through all the directories recursively. We'll then say, okay, we must be at the end of the road. This is our what to do file. We'll then build up all those directories, create a router, and then we'll use the full path to where we are to load up that controller file, that class, and then we'll map the router into the Express instance. So now this base route will be associated with this child router here. Now, if you're new to Express routing, this might seem a little bit complex to start, but here's what's nice about it. You wouldn't even have to modify anything in here. As long as you understand what's going on with the folder structure, we'd be good to go. So if we wanted a route called foo, I could add a new folder called foo, and then I could have a foo.controller.js in here, and then I'd have to put my code, of course, for that, and we'd be done. I would just restart the server, and now there'd be a route called /foo that would map to some functionality in this file. And that's how easy it would be to add new routes. Now, whether or not you like this approach, I'll leave that up to you, but this is what I do for all my Node.js Express apps because it means I write less code. It's very easy to discover the routes first off without actually looking at any code, and it ends up, in my opinion, working out pretty well. All right, so let's try this out, and we'll see the logging that you saw in the router as it creates the routes dynamically. So let me open a terminal here, and I've already started my MongoDB, so I'm just going to run npm start, and it might restart if there's any changes. Okay, it looks like it found one thing. Here we go. So created route, API customers, for, and then it gives you the full path to the customer's controller. So that's what to do when this route is encountered. API/states was created, API/tokens was created, and then we're done. And so that's how routing to the RESTful service is going to work. Now, just to show you this, that hopefully it's working, I can now come into these routes. So API/states, I've already loaded it, but you'll notice this loads all the states. Now I'm using a Postman free Chrome extension you can get. If you haven't seen it before, it's a very popular way to test your RESTful APIs. And you can get that in the Chrome web store. I can also come in and do, for instance, customers. And we can get all the customer data if we'd like. Or we could even come in and get a specific customer. I'd have to find the ID for it, but we could do that as well if we wanted. So it provides a nice way to test our functionality and actually see that JSON coming back. So it looks like the routes are working properly. Now that's a quick look then at this convention-based approach to routing, and that's what we're going to be working with as we move through the rest of the course. One of the more challenging aspects of getting started with Angular is understanding how module loaders work. So I'm going to jump into a demonstration of the configuration of an ES6 module loader and just show you behind the scenes what's going on so that later when we do our imports and exports of various Angular modules, you understand what's really happening behind the scenes. So jumping into the public folder that serves up our static files, we have our index.html. And this is going to be our home page. That'll load our initial Angular 2 scripts. And then we have our loader script. Now we have two aspects to this. First off, we are using System.js in this example. It's just one of many options. You could use Webpack and others, but System.js is one of the easier ways to get started with module loaders. Now ES 2015, the ES6 standard, if you will, for JavaScript is what introduced modules. And this provides a great way to import and export functionality. So instead of using a bunch of script tags, this is all I have for the entire application. You'll notice not one of these is custom aside from right here. So what happens is I define the configuration of where things should start and what are the file names or what are the default extensions, and some things we'll look at here in a moment. And then as the app loads, this system.import app kicks off. That's going to jump into our app folder, and that's going to cause a main.ts to be loaded. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. So let's first go into our System.js config file, which you'll see right here in the root of my public folder. Let's talk about what's going on here. So first off, when I'm doing system import app, that's actually mapping to the app folder that you see right here. And that's why we have this little map section that'll be loaded down here at the bottom. You'll see right here, this is the actual configuration that the System.js module loader is using. So anytime it sees app, it's really just linking over to our app folder. Now Angular, whenever it sees add Angular, it's now linking over to our lib/add Angular. How would it know where to go for those scripts otherwise? It wouldn't. And so as we start to import add Angular core, add Angular forms, or HTTP or other Angular modules, this is where it's going to look at to find the root entry point. Same thing for RxJS. How would it know where to find those scripts? Well, we're going to map that into our lib folder, and this is where we can find that functionality. Now, we also need to say when you go into the app folder, what's the startup file? Where do things kick off from? And that's going to be our main.js. Now, if we go into the app folder, we'll have our main.ts, and this is where we do our bootstrapping of our Angular module that we're going to actually talk about to wrap up this particular module of the course. But this is where we bootstrap the module in. This is how we tell Angular, this is our startup point of the application. So we have all these other imports up here. What happens then is when we say system import app, that goes and reads this configuration. We know app simply maps to the actual app folder. And then we're also saying that in the app folder, we have this main.js. Now, it's main.ts, but of course that's going to get compiled down to ES5. We also have a default extension of JS, so it knows anytime it sees imports, we don't have to put .js on those imports. Just see like this one right here, for instance. So now when it sees add Angular, it knows where to go, lib/add Angular. And then it goes in there and can find these different modules that Angular provides. In this case, when it sees app.module, which you'll see right here, we'll look at this in the next section actually in more detail, then we don't have to put the .js extension because we've already told it that that's the default extension, as you can see here. Same thing for RxJS. We know where to look, and the default extension for files we're going to load there is also going to be JS. Now, as far as the actual Angular modules, when we do add Angular/core, compiler, forms, router, those type of things, you'll notice that I'm registering the key ones right here. And then we have a little function here that loops through each of those package names and calls this setPackageConfig. Now, setPackageConfig either calls this packindex or packumd, depending on what we're working with. In our particular case, we're going to come on in and load in some bundles that will be provided. And these bundles will be located in our lib folder. So if we go into here, into common, you'll see there's bundles in here. Have this universal module definition bundles. These are actually the scripts that are going to be loaded. What will end up happening then is, as a result of this mapping of app to app and RxJS to the lib folder and add Angular to the lib folder, now it not only knows where to go find things as we import, but it also knows where to find the Angular scripts. And that's kind of where this packing type of thing comes into play. Now, this is one of those files that normally you don't really have to touch. You go find a good example out there that gets you started, put it into play in your application, and you're ready to go. But I'd like to talk through it because some people maybe have seen it, but haven't actually taken the time to explore what this actually does. So this is what allows our imports, and our exports. Now, if you're using Webpack or another type of module loader, then yeah, you're going to have different configuration, of course, but this would be specific to System.js and the way that works. So once again, we do our mapping here. We tell where the Angular scripts are. We then tell it the starting point, which is our app folder. That then had configured main.js, once this gets compiled down to ES5, as the startup folder or the end file. And then that kicks off all the imports, which then loads all the other stuff. Angular Core, Angular Platform Browser Dynamic, and all the other types of things. So that's a quick look at the way module loaders work. And what's nice about this, you won't see any other scripts. That's it. We have our helper scripts for Angular. We have our module loader code here, and that drives the entire application. Let's take a look at some of the Angular modules, components, and services that are going to be used in the app to ultimately communicate with our Node.js Express RESTful service on the back end. So diving into the public folder, we have our root module called app module, and this is going to be the main bucket, I like to call it. It's going to hold the other modules that are reusable throughout the app. Now, before I go into more details here, let's jump back into main.ts. And this is where we actually bootstrap app module in, and that makes everything in that bucket available then to use. So going back to app module, there's a few custom things that are being used. First off, we have a root component, and you'll see that that's being declared right here. And then we have some routing components. We'll go into that in just a moment, and I'll show you what's going on there. Now, in addition to that, we also have a core module, which you're going to see is where I like to put my singletons. And then any functionality that's just generally shared, but that can be created multiple times, I call that my shared module. So I have a very consistent approach I like to take. My singletons go into a core module, whereas my reusables could be reusable components or pipes or directives or something like that go in my shared module. You'll see that down here, actually, in the comments. So we declare everything, we bootstrap the root component, and that kicks things off. Now let's take a look, though, before we wrap up here, at some of these shared and core module features, as well as the routing. So let's first go kind of a top-down approach. Let's go into the routing. Now there's many ways you can do routing. This is a really simple app as far as routes go. So I didn't make a separate module for the routes. I took a more simplistic approach that's pretty straightforward. So I import the standard router module. I import components that are going to be used with these routes. And then I have an interface that's going to be used right here for two properties. And all this interface does is says that I have to have two properties, one called routes and one's called components. Now, in addition to that, we define the routes. You'll notice that I have a customer's root route here, and then I have customers with an ID route parameter. So really basic, but there's some other features like a customer's grid and customer's edit you'll see that are imported up top. And the reason I want to point that out is you'll notice I'm exporting this app routing, which has these two properties. So first off, I feed these routes into my router module for root. That's pretty standard, so these then become the root routes. I have a fallback route that if none of these match, it's going to redirect back up to my root route. But then I also export the components that are associated not only with the routes, but any child components that these may use. And I'll get back to why that's being used in just a moment. Now, if I had a more complex scenario, then I generally like to make a routing module. But in this case, it's kind of overkill, at least in my opinion. So by simply exporting this custom app routing object with my two properties, I have everything I need. And I really don't need to create a separate file just for a routing module. All right, so now that you've seen that, let's go back to app module. So we import that routing file. We import the exported app routing item. That allows me to get to the routes. So there's my 4 root routes right there. And then I'm also declaring all the components in one kind of statement. Now the reason that's really nice is all the imports that were back in here don't have to be duplicated in the module file. Otherwise I'd have to import them and then list all those in the declarations array. By doing it this way, I don't have to do that. Now, I could have just as easily made a routing module and done the same type of thing. Then we could just import that module here, and it would have declared the component. So either way works. All right, now the shared module. Not a whole lot in here, actually, but we have a little bit. So we have, you saw earlier as the app was running, a way to filter data as the user types. Well, that's potentially useful throughout an application, so I made that shared. We have a pagination control. Now, that's also shareable. In this app, it's only used once, but could be used as the app grows if it did. We also have some pipes to capitalize data, trim off spaces, things like that. Well, those are certainly reusable. And then the rest of this is just defining these in my module. So here's my shared module. I do all my imports of these reusable items. I declare them, and we're good to go. Now, some of these, like filter text box component, uses ng model, the directive. So I'm importing, you'll notice, forms module, because I need to be able to get to that. But aside from that, we just simply declare these, then we export these as well to make sure that any importing module can also get to these. Now, we know the importing module is our app module. So we import that, and there's our shared module. So now all that functionality is going to be available to any of these components here. Now, the final one is where we'll spend quite a bit of time, actually. We won't touch necessarily the shared code a whole lot. But if I go to core, this is my singletons. So this is my services that I really do only want created once. And the main service we're going to start building out is data service. I won't go into this in detail here, but this is what's ultimately going to interact with the Node.js Express RESTful service. And so you'll notice my RxJS imports, my HTTP import, and those types of things. So if I go to the module for this core module here, you'll notice that I'm importing the standard suspects up here, ng module, but I'm also importing HTTP module, because of course we want HTTP functionality here. And then all of my singletons are being defined as providers. Of course, we have to have a provider, so the injector service can then inject these into the different components and maybe other services. Now, I also have something unique going on here, and this is a very custom solution, but I want to make sure that nobody else, no higher up level modules, have defined any of these. I really want them to be singletons. So you'll notice I have this ensure module loaded once guard. And what that's going to do is there's a little bit of code here on this core module to actually check, have any of these other items already been loaded? So it's going to check to make sure that core module is only loaded one time. And that one time would be here in app module, right there. Now, what this will do is using some kind of trickery that I have in here, this will go in and this base class, and I'll let you look at that one if you're interested, but it will ensure by walking up that core modules only loaded one time. And that would mean if core modules only loaded one time, singletons for our different services. Now, this is certainly optional, and given that this is not a super complex app, certainly overkill in this example, but in a larger scale app, this is something that's nice, and it'll be available in the app if you'd like to check out some more code there. But that's all our singletons. Those get loaded back into here, and that's where we're going to spend quite a bit of time, is in this core module. Now, the last piece to show you that's in here is we need to load our customers. We have edit capability, and we have the grid capability. And so that's all going to be done with our various components. So you'll notice that I have a customer edit component, a customers component, which then loads a customer's grid component and the filter text box and paging and things like that. So we'll start to dive into some of these as well as we move along throughout the course. So that's how everything's organized as far as the Angular code goes. So we've seen how the module loader works. We've seen the different levels of modules that we have. We have our root module, our core module for singletons, and our shared module, and then my routes, and we declare all the components right here that we're going to be using. So what we're going to do moving forward in the course is I'll start to build out the get type of data request to the server, and we'll show how to build the server piece and the client side piece and the service, and then use that component. Then we'll talk about how do we update data, how do we insert data, delete data, and all those different things. I did using Express Generator and learned about some of the key folders and files used in the application for the RESTful service and for the Angular part of the overall application. We've also taken a look at how NPM modules are used on both the Node.js side and the Angular side, how the application has a more convention-based routing feature that actually looks in the controllers folder to determine the routes that are to use for the RESTful service. And then we also looked at the different Angular modules, the custom modules that are being used in the app, such as the core module, the shared module, and how those are used in the root module. So moving forward, what we'll be doing now is dissecting the individual pieces of the application and building out that code. So we'll talk about how we can get data into the app. That'll be our next topic. And then from there, we'll talk about different ways we can work with manipulating that data.